Today is early February 13th, 2023. I want to talk about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, but before I get into that, and that is what I will be talking about for the majority of this video, I first want to touch on the situation in Syria and how U.S. sanctions, ongoing U.S. sanctions, have compounded efforts to try to aid victims of this earthquake. This earthquake hit both Turkey and Syria. Thousands and thousands have died, many thousands more injured, missing, or otherwise displaced by this tragedy. And U.S. sanctions are deliberately compounding the situation for Syria. And I want to show you this from the Washington Post. Now, if you go to the Washington Post today and look at this op-ed, it says lifting sanctions on Syria won't help earthquake victims. But that is not the original title of this op-ed. The original title was don't lift sanctions on Syria to help earthquake victims. And this is by a former U.S. State Department policy expert. And that original title is much more accurate to the actual intentions of this op-ed versus what they try to make it appear to be. So it says, following the devastating series of earthquakes that struck southern Turkey and northwest Syria on Monday, the Syrian regime has re-energized its calls for lifting sanctions leveled against it. The U.S. State Department has thus far rightly dismissed such calls, but as the full scope of the destruction and human suffering comes into focus, expect these calls to intensify. Here's why the United States should hold its ground. And then it says, while sanctions have certainly contributed to stunting government expenditures and the Syrian lira's depreciation, they have had no significant bearing on the delivery of humanitarian assistance. And he makes all of these ridiculous claims that somehow the U.S. is actually helping everyone in Syria and there is no humanitarian catastrophe. That is all an absolute lie. The U.S. is placing sanctions on Syria deliberately to cripple the economy. They're also militarily occupying eastern Syria, where the majority of Syria's agriculture and energy, oil production takes place. They're doing this to deny people food and energy. They're trying to starve and freeze the Syrian population. And they're doing this for leverage because their proxy war against the Syrian government has failed. This is what they're using as leverage to try to coerce Syria and its allies to do what the U.S. tells them to do in this region of the world, thousands of miles away from U.S. shores. And I know what some people are saying. Brian, you're a Putin puppet and an Assad apologist, so of course you would say that. But as a matter of fact, I didn't say any of this. I'm simply repeating what Dana Stroll, here she is. This is her official profile at the official website of the U.S. Department of Defense. Dana Stroll is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. She also, in this biography, she has also worked for the U.S. State Department and as an expert at a U.S. embassy overseas. So she represents the U.S. government, and she is the one that said the sanctions and the U.S. occupation of eastern Syria are there to make the Syrian population suffer. This war has turned Syria into rubble, and this is a good way the U.S. can keep it rubble until Syria does what the U.S. tells them to do. This is her. Let's listen. In 2019, this is what she said.
The United States still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified four. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the U.S. military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria Study Group's report, and then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. But we argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned, both to fight ISIS and also as leverage before affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict. There were three other areas of leverage. One is political and diplomatic isolation of the Assad regime, so holding the line on diplomatic isolation, preventing embassies from going back into Damascus. Two is the economic sanctions architecture. So some of this is part of the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration on Iran, but there's a whole suite of both executive and congressional sanctions on Syria and Bashar al-Assad, both for human rights abuses in Syria and to the backers of Assad for their activities in support of him in Syria. And three was reconstruction aid. So the United States remains the overall largest single donor of humanitarian aid to Syrians both inside Syria and refugees outside of Syria. And there was some stabilization assistance in the part of Syria that was liberated from ISIS and controlled via the Syrian Democratic Forces in northern eastern Syria. The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argued that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
You heard from Dana herself. The sanctions are there to make the Syrian government scream. They turned Syria into rubble, and they will keep it rubble until Syria does what the U.S. tells them. The earthquake has only helped enhance this policy, so they're going to do everything they can to take advantage of the earthquake and make the Syrian people suffer as much as possible. And that is very important to keep in mind as I move on to talk about Ukraine, because this is what the U.S. does everywhere. This is the true nature of U.S. foreign policy. Dana is just being honest about what the U.S. does and why the U.S. does it. And I don't think anybody should be shocked or surprised about this at all. And we should keep this in mind as we examine and analyze U.S. foreign policy. So with that said, let's take a look at the situation in Ukraine. As always, I go to liveuamap.com. This is a pro-Ukrainian live map. Keep that in mind as we take a look at it. And we still have fighting taking place in the southern Donbas region around Vuhledar. You see these red rifle icons outside of the Russian-held territory indicated by red. That means that Russian forces are advancing and putting pressure on Ukrainian positions there in Vuhledar. They're also doing it here around Marinka. If we go up to Bakhmut, where the main battle is taking place, and you can see that since my last update, the encirclement has become much more noticeable. You have Russian forces pushing toward Chasiv Yar and poised to cut off this main road here. And you also have kind of a smaller cauldron within a larger cauldron developing around Krasnogora. You also see Russian forces developing this breakthrough at Soledar to the north, to the west, and to the north towards Seversk. And we see these red rifle icons quite far away from Russian-held territory, moving westward toward the furthest extent Ukraine went with their Kharkov offensive. And all while this is taking place, another massive Russian missile and drone campaign took place just this week. We have articles like this from Financial Times. Russia launches fresh missile bombardment on Ukraine. One projectile crosses neighboring Moldovan airspace, highlighting risk of conflict spilling over. And they do, to be fair, they do mention the fact that Ukrainian air defense missiles actually crossed over Inzupol and hit Polish territory and killed 2 people. The Financial Times says Russia launched another mass missile attack against Ukrainian targets on Friday, hitting electricity infrastructure across the country and causing explosions in Kiev. The Ukrainian grid operator said that there were strikes at several high-voltage infrastructure facilities in the eastern, western, and southern regions, pretty much everywhere, triggering power outages. Earlier, electricity was preemptively cut in the Kiev and Dnipropetrovsk regions in anticipation of the missile attack. Ukrainian officials said late last year that repeated strikes had crippled 40% of the grid infrastructure, and many parts of the country have endured rolling power outages for months. And then we have this article from Reuters about the same topic. Ukraine says 3 major regions can avoid power cuts after attacks. Well, they don't actually really explain clearly what they meant by that. But the article says Ukraine's energy minister said Russia had hit power facilities in 6 regions with missiles and drones, causing blackouts across most of the country. Ukraine's armed forces said Russian forces had fired more than 100 missiles and mounted 12 air and 20 shelling attacks on Friday. It said 61 Russian cruise missiles were destroyed. Russia has repeatedly attacked civilian infrastructure far from the front lines, leaving millions of Ukrainians without power, heat, or water for days at a time in the middle of winter. It seems very clear that Russia is making a huge number of cruise missiles every single month. Could be up to 100 missiles a month. And they save them all for a single salvo or 2 smaller salvos. And the reason why is because we hear about Ukraine shooting down these missiles, and every once in a while we'll see videos of it. I believe this claim of 61 Russian cruise missiles being destroyed, that sounds outlandish. I highly doubt that it's true. They are hitting missiles, though, and Russia knows this. They calculate that into the size and frequency of these salvos. They know a certain number of them are going to be hit. They are using cruise missiles, Garand 2 drones. They're also using decoys to saturate Ukrainian air defense so that a large enough amount of missiles gets through, hits their targets, and the missile salvo is a success, an overall success. And we see Ukraine's power grid degrading. Over the months, we see it being dismantled. So this is a success for Russia. This is a failure of Ukraine's air defense. You're shooting the missiles down, but Russia is still achieving its objective of dismantling your power grid. So that is not, by any stretch of the imagination, success at all. There was also a report, and I'm going to file this under unconfirmed. There was a report that there was a unmanned naval vessel that carried out a strike at a bridge in Odessa. And you can see it. It looks like a surface vessel of some kind moving along, and it detonates right under the bridge. And so this could possibly be the beginning of Russia not only using the Garand 2 drones in the air, but whatever this naval drone is on the surface or just below the surface to target things like bridges. This is something we'll have to keep an eye out for, see if there's any official acknowledgement of it on the Russian side or any talk about it in the Western media in upcoming updates. Now let's talk about what is going on in terms of Western aid to Ukraine. We hear about Russia preparing to launch an offensive at any moment, any day now. The main offensive could happen. And we keep hearing talks about Russia executing some big arrow offensive, sweeping movements, armored columns, trying to seize huge tracts of land. And I don't know if that is what Russia is going to do or not. I don't sit in on the Russian General Staff's meetings, but I would just point out that what is also possible is that Russia is staging huge numbers of troops in different places to exploit any collapse in terms of Ukraine's fighting capacity. They're adding more and more men and equipment along the entire line of contact. They're increasing the pressure absolutely everywhere. You see them pushing hard on Bakhmut, forcing Ukraine to commit large numbers of men and equipment to try to prevent the taking of Bakhmut. But you also see Ukraine rushing reserves to other areas. Russia is putting pressure on along the line of contact, and I believe they're going to continue doing this until they can see that Ukraine's manpower and equipment is exhausted. to where some kind of offensive can be mounted. Now, you don't launch a major offensive into prepared defenses that are well manned. If you do that, you're going to suffer huge losses in both men and equipment. And there's no reason for Russia to do that. Their goal is to destroy the Ukrainian military. The Ukrainian military is coming to Russia. There's no reason for them to move past their defensive lines and risk being cut off from their supplies or being encircled by Ukrainian forces, being targeted on multiple sides because they've moved in too far into Ukrainian-held territory. These are all things that lead me to believe that Russia may not launch an offensive in that way, unless, of course, there is a collapse of Ukrainian fighting capacity, and then they will move in to exploit that because they perceive the danger to those forces moving forward is greatly reduced. We are hearing talk about tanks. We're hearing talk about armored vehicles and longer range missiles, and I've talked about all of this. I'm also going to talk about warplanes, Western warplanes being transferred to Ukraine. I want to point out this podcast, War on the Rocks, Unfolding Offensives and Counteroffensives in Ukraine. And it's Michael Kaufman, hosted by Ryan Evans. And Michael Kaufman makes a really good point. He's obviously pro-Ukrainian, pro-NATO. He's born in Ukraine, and he wants and he thinks that Ukraine is going to win. But what he does say about this upcoming Ukrainian offensive that the U.S. is supposedly arming Ukraine for, giving them these tanks for, he says that even if the Ukrainian offensive is successful, they are going to lose hundreds and hundreds of vehicles, just like they did around Kherson and Kharkov. They're going to lose hundreds of vehicles, even if they're successful. And if they're not successful, they'll lose even more. And at the end of the offensive, they will be right back to where they are now, where they are waiting for the West to deliver them another army. So I thought that was quite interesting. What's going to be different about this upcoming offensive, if that's really what Ukraine is planning to do, what's different about this offensive versus their previous offensives, Kherson and Kharkov, is that they're going to be using a larger proportion of Western equipment that they are not trained to use. They will not be able to use effectively on the battlefield versus the Soviet-era equipment that NATO had been transferring to them ahead of the Kherson and Kharkov offensives. That's a really important fact to keep in mind. Now we have tweets like this. This is the deputy foreign minister of Ukraine, and he says just a few words on the absurdity of Germany's debates. Ukraine Air Force desperately needs German fighter jets, Tornado and Eurofighter, to free our people under occupation. But Berlin replies, how dare you to demand warplanes? We're so traumatized after 11 months of Leopard birth pangs. Unbelievable. Andrei Melnik, he's an international law expert and definitely not an expert in military matters. Ukraine could be in desperate need of air power, but they have absolutely no means of utilizing it unless NATO pilots are going to fly for Ukraine. And that seems to be the conundrum that the West is trying to get around. We have articles like this. This was during the visit of Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky to the UK. This is the UK's government website. PM extends Ukraine military training to pilots and Marines as President Zelensky makes first visit to the UK since the invasion. And it says, the training will ensure pilots are able to fly sophisticated NATO standard fighter jets in the future. As part of that long-term capability investment, the UK will work with Ukraine and international allies to coordinate collective support to meet Ukraine's defensive needs. So they're talking about long-term capability investments. That's what they're calling this, because they are admitting that this cannot be done anytime soon. We have this from Reuters. No magic wand in Ukraine war, says UK's Wallace on question of supplying jets. And this says, Wallace did not rule out the possibility of sending jets, but said fighter aircraft were not what Ukraine needed right now, and that there were practical issues to consider, such as the many months it would take to train Ukrainian forces to use them. And it also says, Sunak's spokesman said the quickest a pilot could learn to fly a British jet was 35 months. So that's years. That's years from now. I also want to point out this article from Air and Space Forces magazine. And the title is, Romania is a model for training Ukraine's pilots to fly F-16. So you're looking at this article and you're thinking, wow, someone has already did it. That gives us hope that Ukraine can do it. But let's take a look at the details. It says the Ukrainian Air Force has withstood 6 months of war against a much larger and more sophisticated Russian force. But U.S. lawmakers worry Russia could gain air superiority as the war grinds on unless Ukrainian pilots are equipped and trained to fly modern Western aircraft, such as the F-16. And when we're talking about Russia having an advantage in the air, they already do, but as they whittle down Ukrainian air defenses, they're going to be able to operate in the skies over Ukraine with more and more impunity. That's an important factor to keep in mind. The article says Romania, a NATO member, offers a case study for how that could go. Its Air Force is completing a transition from Soviet-era MiG-21s to US-built F-16s, providing a model for training pilots for the switch, according to U.S. airmen involved with the training. The U.S. Air Force's Air Education and Training Command even has a course for partner and ally nation pilots that could be tailored for Ukraine. So far, so good. It sounds great. But then it says, from trained pilots and maintainers to required infrastructure to a boneyard of spare aircraft, Romania has been working on its transition to the F-16 for nearly a decade, 10 years. Even we struggle at this point, and we started enhancing and getting the F-16 like 7 or 8 years ago, and we're still not there yet. And this was a Romanian Air Force pilot saying this. It also says, we are so close, we are waiting and willing to be there as personnel and maintenance as even a force. And so what they're telling you is that Romania, under ideal conditions, they still haven't completed the transition. It's been going on for 10 years. I have pointed out many times that the Turkish-built Bayraktar TB2 drone that Ukraine was using at the beginning of the special military operation, they aren't anymore because they're all gone. They've been shot down and destroyed. That took them years between buying it, setting it up, training everyone, figuring out how they would use it in actual combat operations. That took them 2 to 3 years. That is a drone, a relatively small drone program. And it still had no impact. And it wasn't as if they weren't rushing. They wanted to use the Bayraktar TB2 in the Donbas region. Before the special military operation began, they actually did begin using it. It just didn't make any difference on the battlefield. And so when we're talking about manned military aviation, everything that you need is on a much larger scale. And that goes in terms of the actual size of everything that you need, the quantities of everything that you need, as well as the time that you're going to need to set all of this up. It's just not feasible. So that means the West is telling you, the Western governments, the Western media, Western experts are telling you that there is no way to send Western warplanes to Ukraine for Ukrainian pilots to use anytime soon. It will take years to do that. And if the West does send Western warplanes to Ukraine to use, within the year or within the next 2 years, then you could be sure that it's NATO pilots operating them, merely posing as Ukrainian pilots. And that is going to come with its own risks. And even in that case, there's no guarantee that it's going to make any difference. Ukraine had an air force at the beginning of the special military operation. Russia destroyed the warplanes on the ground. They attacked air bases they were operating out of. They have air defense systems capable of shooting them down. And they also have their own military aviation able to take these jets out from long ranges before even crossing into Ukrainian territory. So this will be the multitude of factors facing even a NATO pilot in a warplane, posing as a Ukrainian pilot, trying to operate in the skies over Ukraine right now. since I started talking about Syria, and now we're talking about Ukraine, I want to draw attention to a similarity that I'm starting to see here in Syria when Washington's proxy war started to go wrong, and it was obvious that it wasn't going to work. The Western media and these fake NGOs funded by the US government, by European governments, they got together and they began fabricating what could only be called absurd war propaganda to try to manipulate public perception, to keep support for the conflict going, to allow continued investment in the proxy war to be justified publicly, politically. And now we're starting to see a very similar thing take place in Ukraine. So we have this CNN article: just to survive, Wagner fighters recount the horrors of battles in eastern Ukraine. And it starts out by saying 2 former fighters of the Russian private military company Wagner have told CNN of their horrific experiences on the battlefield in eastern Ukraine, and how anyone who faltered was immediately shot by their own commanders. The 2 fighters were captured by Ukrainian forces late last year. CNN is not disclosing their identities for their own safety. For security reasons, the Ukrainians kept a presence in the room where the interview took place. CNN told the fighters that they could end the interview at any time they wished, but they spoke in detail for more than an hour. So these are prisoners of war that CNN is photographing, making a video out of. There's actually a video of this interview where CNN is talking to them and they're giving answers, and they make utterly absurd claims. They talk about how they were carrying out wave after wave of attack on Ukrainian positions, but then in the next sentence they're talking about how Ukraine was carrying out waves of attacks on them. They talked about losing almost everyone in their unit repeatedly. I guess they were extremely lucky. That's what they're claiming, that they were in this wave, everyone was killed. They were in that wave, everyone was killed except for them. They had no choice. They had to take an objective. Any retreat would be punished by on-the-spot execution. They had to take any objective they were given by their commanders by any means necessary. But then in the next sentence, they said they were given an order to retreat, and that's when they got caught. So which is it? Why would your commanders, if they don't care about you and they're just sending in human waves, why would they ever order you to retreat? It makes no sense. And if you're carrying out human wave attacks on Ukraine, when do you have time to have a human wave attack by Ukraine on you? So the whole interview, these claims being made were utterly absurd. And CNN themselves say that out of the 50,000 recruits Wagner has brought to the battlefield, 80% are either dead, injured, or captured, which means there's only 10,000 Wagner fighters left. So can someone explain to me how only 10,000 Wagner fighters left on the battlefield are still encircling and taking Bakhmut right now as I'm recording this? How is that possible? And of course it is not possible, because everything CNN and these 2 alleged prisoners of war being filmed and accompanied by their captors, this is all propaganda. That is exactly what this is. And do you remember this? And I'm using CNN just to make a point here. This is also CNN. UK sanctions British blogger over videos from Ukraine. And this is Graham Phillip. And Graham Phillip interviewed Aidan Aslan, this British volunteer fighting on the Ukrainian side, captured by the Donbas militias. And he interviewed him while he was in captivity. And this CNN article says, the British Foreign Office says Phillip's work constitutes media content that supports and promotes actions and policies which destabilize Ukraine and undermine or threaten the territorial integrity, sovereignty, or independence of Ukraine. And the article also says on April 20th, and this article is from last year, British MP Robert Jenrick who represents Aslan's constituency in the UK, criticized the video in Parliament as a flagrant breach of the Geneva Conventions. Treating any prisoner of war in this manner is illegal, and the interviewer, Graham Phillips, is in danger of prosecution for war crimes, and that any online platform such as YouTube that hosts propaganda videos of this kind should be taken down immediately, he said. So what about CNN? Because they've just done the exact same thing. They have these two Wagner fighters, very similar in status to Aiden Aslan, this UK volunteer who was in Ukraine and was captured by Donbas militias and then interviewed by Graham Phillips while in custody. The same scenario. Well, why don't we hear CNN being condemned? They're doing the exact same thing. Why aren't we hearing CNN condemned? Just some hypocrisy to throw in there, along with everything else. So you have CNN interviewing two prisoners of war held captive by Ukraine with the captors in the room with them, and they're pretending that this is somehow journalistic, as if these two men aren't going, if they are actual prisoners of war, they're not going to say anything they think is going to buy favor with their captors. Utterly absurd. And this is all to concoct some sort of narrative that even as we watch Wagner win in Bakhmut, they're still losing. And since I said that the Western governments, the Western media, they get together with these fake NGOs, I just want to point out that in this video, they cite this woman, Olga Romanova, Russia behind bars. And this is a fake NGO connected to the US government, funded by the European government. There's a Bloomberg article right here. This is from 2018. And in this article, it actually says, and they're talking about Olga Romanova and her Russia Behind Bars organization. She gave the annual budget as $250,000 US and said Russia Behind Bars has been crowdfunded, but is seeking grants from European Union governments. If they proclaim us foreign agents as a result, we'll proudly carry this title, she said, although that would subject the group to greater scrutiny by the law enforcement and tax authorities. And then since then, she did get a grant from the European Commission, and the staff in her NGO. I mean, how is it a non-governmental organization if it's being funded by a government? So this is from the National Endowment for Democracy. This is 2019, reporting from the front lines of authoritarianism, a conversation with the 2019 Vaclav Havel Journalism Fellows. So all of the people at this event talking, they're getting this fellowship award. It's an initiative by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic, and Radio Free Europe, that is US government-funded media. And here, Karina Merkurayeva. She is a journalist who has worked for a number of NGOs and independent Russian media outlets, including the Prisoners' Rights Project, Russia Behind Bars, Open Russia, another fake NGO funded by the US government, by the European Union, and run by corrupt Russian oligarch and convicted criminal Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And she writes about regional and domestic politics, business, and culture. So CNN is citing Russia Behind Bars for their little piece on these two alleged Wagner fighters captured allegedly by Ukraine. They're citing an NGO that is just a cutout of the US government to buttress these lies. And they're doing exactly what they were doing in Syria when the proxy war started to go very poorly. They all got together and they began fabricating all kinds of stories to try to manipulate public perception, to give them the impression that things were going better than they were, and that the public should continue supporting this, even though it was a hopeless cause. And I'm pointing this out because we watched this take place in Syria. We're now seeing it take place in Ukraine. And what I want to end on is, if things were actually going well in Ukraine for the United States and its proxies, why wouldn't they simply just talk about that? Why wouldn't they just take examples of what is happening in reality and talk about that? Why are they putting so much energy in fabricating stories about supposed Wagner fighters captured by Ukraine and then having to bring in a fake NGO connected to the US government and the European Union? Why would you have to bring them in to give the illusion of credibility? That does it for this update. If you thought it was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. Also in the video description below are all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as ways you can help support my work. I don't monetize my YouTube channel. If you see an ad pop up, feel free to block it or skip it because it's not helping me at all. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether you're donating month to month or through one-time donations, or even if you're just sharing this work with others and getting this information out there into other people's hands, thank you so much. That helps tremendously. I greatly appreciate that. Thank you again. And as always, thank you for watching.